America did not hate Britain. The evidence does not support that. But the wartime alliance was far rougher than the photographs suggest. An official history of the United States Army describes American planners suspecting that their British ally was more interested in securing a post-war empire than in defeating Germany as soon as possible. At the same time, Roosevelt was supporting Britain. Churchill was fighting for American aid. British and American chiefs were building a combined system to coordinate the war. So what exactly were these allies arguing about? Strategy, empire, trade, and the kind of world that would exist when Germany was defeated. The strange thing about the Anglo-American alliance is not that Britain and America disagreed. It is how fiercely they could disagree and still continue fighting the same war together. Friends, stop for just a moment. We are very close to 1,000 subscribers. There is only a little way left. Please subscribe, press the hype button, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you think. Thank you. Now, let us continue. Because the suspicion recorded in that American military history did not appear from nowhere. Go back to September 1939. War had begun in Europe. The United States was not fighting it. Gallup asked Americans how far their country should go in helping England and France. 58% supported selling aircraft and other war materials to them. Only 16% supported sending the American Army and Navy abroad to fight Germany. In a separate question, 90% opposed an American declaration of war in support of England, France, and Poland. Those figures describe distance, not hatred. Material help was one question. Sending American forces into another European war was a very different one. Britain, however, could not treat time as a debating point. By 1940, the British government was seeking greater American help. Roosevelt wanted to support Britain, but he also operated inside an American political argument over neutrality and direct involvement in foreign wars. Churchill needed support from across the Atlantic. The relationship that developed is often reduced to two men, Roosevelt and Churchill. The United States National Archives describes them as developing a close, working friendship. That description matters because it rules out the easiest version of this story. Roosevelt was not simply the secret enemy of Britain, and Churchill was not negotiating with a president who merely wanted Britain to fail. The relationship was close. The interests were not identical. In 1940, the United States transferred 50 destroyers to Britain in exchange for 99-year leases on base sites in British possessions in the Western Hemisphere. Then came Lend-Lease. American material support expanded before the United States entered the European War. Britain needed ships, weapons, supplies, and access to American productive power. Washington was also asking what American assistance should mean. In July 1941, that question appears in a memorandum of conversation. John Maynard Keynes was examining a proposed Lend-Lease agreement. He reached Article 7 and asked whether the provision raised the issue of imperial preference and Britain's post-war trade controls. The American answer was yes. No conspiracy is required here. The disagreement is already on paper. Keynes argued strongly against the provision. The American side argued that, after receiving vast aid, Britain could not simply adopt measures directed against American trade and should cooperate in removing discriminatory practices. The conversation had moved beyond the immediate delivery of war material. The war was still being fought. Britain still needed American support. Yet officials were already discussing rules that might shape trade after the fighting ended. Imperial preference concerned trading arrangements within the British imperial system. For American officials, discriminatory trade practices affected American commercial interests. For Britain, the issue touched an existing imperial and economic structure. The friction was genuine. What the documents do not establish is a secret American plan to give Britain weapons for the single purpose of destroying the British Empire. Economic pressure is documented. Disagreement is documented. The larger conspiracy claim is not. That distinction matters because the actual conflict is strong enough without inventing one. A few weeks later, Roosevelt and Churchill met at the Atlantic Conference. The two leaders discussed war aims and principles for a post-war international system. The Atlantic Charter included principles concerning trade and the right of peoples to choose their form of government. They had come closer, but they had not arrived with precisely the same immediate objective. The State Department's historical account says Churchill's primary goal was to get the Americans into the war. Failing that, Britain wanted more American aid and a warning to Japan. Roosevelt had American political and policy concerns of his own. The two governments could sign a common declaration while approaching the meeting from different positions. That is, coalition politics before the coalition was even fully at war together. Then, in December 1941, the United States entered the war. The entire argument changed shape. Britain and America were now military partners against Germany. The problem was no longer how far the United States should go in helping Britain. Now, the two countries had to make a global war strategy together, and almost immediately, the map became an argument. Where should the main blow against Germany fall? American planners pressed for direct action against the principal German forces in continental Europe. British leaders approached the problem through a different strategic calculation. The official history of the United States Army describes American planners disagreeing ardently with the British preference for wearing Germany down before a final continental confrontation. It also places British thinking in the context of limited resources and recent military experience. Dunkirk was recent. Dieppe would add another brutal warning about assaulting a defended European coast. The memory of Gallipoli and the enormous losses of the First World War also formed part of the background described in the American official history. None of that proves that every British proposal was correct, nor does it prove that every American demand for direct action was reckless. The disagreement was about risk, resources, and timing. American planners looked at the growing resources the United States could bring into the war and argued for concentration against the main German power. British leaders were acutely aware that Britain's resources were limited. A premature assault across the Channel was not a theoretical danger. It had to be measured in landing craft, trained formations, air support, shipping, and the possibility of heavy losses. British strategy, therefore, gave greater weight to Mediterranean and peripheral operations. American planners repeatedly returned to the direct continental problem. Both sides wanted Germany defeated. They argued over the route and the timetable. Here, the dispute became more dangerous. A disagreement over a map can remain technical. A disagreement over why your ally prefers one map to another can become political. The official U.S. Army history records a remarkable suspicion. American planners suspected that Britain was more interested in securing a post-war empire than in defeating Germany as soon as possible. The wording must stay precise. American planners suspected. The source records their suspicion. It does not prove that British leaders were deliberately prolonging the war to save the empire. But the existence of that suspicion inside the planning relationship tells us how deep the dispute had become. British resistance to an early cross-channel assault could be explained through military risk and limited resources. British leaders also had strategic interests in the Mediterranean and across a global imperial system. From an American planning perspective, those factors could become entangled. A British proposal for another operation away from northern France might therefore be judged on two levels. Would it help defeat Germany? And what British interest might it also serve? Britain could ask a similar question about American pressure. Was Washington arguing only from military logic, or was the growing material strength of the United States also changing who could push hardest at the conference table? We do not need to invent private thoughts to see the pressure. The official record shows argument, objection, negotiation, and changing decisions. Then, the balance of resources shifted. By the middle of 1943, the official U.S. Army history judged the importance of American resources to have become so great that British leaders had little choice but to go along with the cross-channel direction preferred by their ally. That is a severe sentence. It does not mean Britain became irrelevant. British commanders continued to argue, plan, and contribute to Allied strategy. British forces remained central to the war in Europe and beyond. The sentence describes leverage. Resources affected bargaining power. As American military strength expanded, the American position carried greater weight inside the coalition. The sequence is worth following carefully. First, Britain was asking how much help America would provide. Then the two countries were formal military partners, arguing over combined strategy. By 1943, the growing importance of American resources was altering the balance within those arguments. Military integration was deepening at the same time as the relationship was becoming less equal in material terms. And the dispute was never confined to invasion plans. Empire remained part of the conversation. At Tehran in 1943, official American minutes recorded Roosevelt discussing colonial possessions. Roosevelt said he thought it better not to raise India with Churchill because, in Roosevelt's view, Churchill had no solution and wanted to defer the issue until after the war. This is Roosevelt's recorded assessment. It does not turn the United States into the architect of Indian independence. It does not reduce the political struggle in India to Roosevelt and Churchill. Indian political agency and the history of British rule cannot be compressed into a private disagreement between two Western leaders. But the record shows Roosevelt expressing a clear view about Churchill's handling of the Indian question. Colonial questions remained inside the wartime relationship. The war against Germany did not erase disagreement over the kind of world that might follow Germany's defeat. Then, a document from Iran makes the picture stranger still. In 1943, an American memorandum reported a growing feeling among British officials in the field that the United States had ambitions to become a colonial power. The same memorandum noted extensive Axis propaganda, claiming that Americans intended to take over the British Empire. The scope here is narrow: Iran. British officials in the field, one American memorandum reporting a growing feeling. This is not evidence that the British government discovered an American plot to steal the empire. It is evidence that, in one wartime setting, suspicion could also travel in the opposite direction. American planners could question British imperial motives. Some British officials in Iran could question American ambitions. At the same time, British and American officers were trying to coordinate a global conflict. How did that alliance avoid breaking under the weight of its own arguments? The answer is visible in the machinery they built. After the Arcadia Conference, British and American chiefs established the Combined Chiefs of Staff structure. The United States National Archives records that the chiefs held 20 meetings in Washington between January 23 and May 19, 1942, to coordinate the war effort. 20 meetings in less than 4 months. The number is revealing because coordination did not depend on pretending that British and American interests were identical. Different assumptions entered the room. Different strategic preferences entered the room. Different national priorities entered the room. Then, decisions had to come out. Sometimes, British arguments prevailed. Sometimes, American weight became decisive. Sometimes a compromise changed the course of the discussion. The institution did not abolish conflict, it gave conflict a place to be worked through. That is the central fact hidden by the word hatred. America did not hate Britain as a historical national fact. The evidence does not support it. In 1939, much of the American public was willing to support material aid while remaining deeply reluctant to send American forces into the European War. Roosevelt and Churchill developed a close working friendship. American aid to Britain expanded before direct American entry. Economic negotiations touched imperial preference and post-war trade. Military planners fought over Mediterranean strategy and a cross-channel assault. American planners suspected British imperial priorities. Roosevelt and Churchill differed over colonial questions. A narrow American memorandum from Iran recorded suspicion moving the other way. American resources increasingly strengthened Washington's bargaining position. None of those facts cancels the others. That is why the alliance is more interesting than the title. Britain needed American power. The United States needed an effective coalition capable of defeating Germany. Britain defended British interests. The United States defended American interests. National priorities did not vanish because Roosevelt and Churchill could work together. They were forced into the same strategic problem. And the solution was not perfect friendship. It was repeated negotiation. The simple versions of this history are comfortable. America saved Britain. Britain manipulated America. Roosevelt betrayed Churchill. Churchill used Roosevelt. Each version gives the audience one motive, one direction, and one side to blame. The wartime record is less tidy. Britain and the United States became extraordinarily close military partners while disagreeing over strategy, trade, empire, and the post-war order. Their arguments were real. The changing balance of resources was real. So was the cooperation. By the end of the European War, British and American forces had fought within a much larger Allied effort against the same enemy. That wider coalition included the Soviet Union, Commonwealth forces, and many other Allied nations whose sacrifices cannot be erased from the story. The Anglo-American relationship was one part of that coalition, but it was a remarkably important part, and its achievement was not affection. It was decision-making under pressure. Think again about those 20 meetings in Washington. 20 meetings in less than 4 months. Not a photograph, not a slogan about a special relationship. A table at which two powers repeatedly brought their disagreements into the same system, because the war required an answer. Hatred would have made the story simpler. The documents give us something harder. Two countries that needed each other. Two countries protecting their own interests. Two countries increasingly unequal in material power. And a wartime alliance capable of turning friction into decisions. That may be the most revealing fact of all. Coalition warfare did not demand that Britain and America always agree. It demanded that, after the argument, they still decide what to do next. Tell us what you think in the comments. Did these arguments strengthen the Anglo-American alliance by forcing difficult decisions into the open, or did victory simply make the tensions easier to forget? Subscribe to Defiant Britain WW2. Press the hype button, leave a like, and tell us which British-American wartime disagreement deserves its own episode next.